right, I am here with my man, the education director for Function First, Kevin Murray, all the way up in Edmonton, Alberta. Kevin, thanks for taking some time, and I'm going to ask you a few questions. Hopefully you can bring some value to those folks that are familiar with what we do with Function First. Some people are going to know you already, or at least your name as a director of education. I certainly wanted to put a little face with that name and talk a little bit about right now. First is your immediate background in terms of what you've just accomplished in terms academically and how that might be of value to the listeners as it relates to this sort of unusual circumstance that we're all dealing with and for a little bit longer than maybe we anticipated. So tell us about what you just finished up a few months ago and how that has changed your perspective on sort of human behavior, if nothing else.
Yeah. No, first of all, it's a privilege to be here and contribute to the folks that you've been working with and been in contact with over the years. I have the unique lens, not just from a movement and biomechanical understanding, but I just finished a year ago, exactly this month, my master's degree in counseling psychology. So I've really been able to acquire another lens, so to speak, to be able to see how this thing called psychology, or the way in which our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, and our cognitions influence our behavior and actions, and how do we interpret times such as right now, where there's just an abundance of uncertainty and not many answers. How do we go about navigating such uncertain times? And I think I've got some a unique insight in terms of how we might be able to look at some things here and how we might be able to move forward amongst all the uncertainty.
Sure. And a lot of that uncertainty is around disruption of normal lifestyles, certainly economics. And for so many people that might be listening to this from the Function First family, it's going to be how is their body dealing with this, or are they even associating some of the added stress and limitations and uncertainty to why they're feeling what they're feeling?
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, can you remember a time when so many areas in life have had an immediate disruption? I know I can't, and I haven't talked to anybody else who has. So, it's a real challenge in front of us here, and I think that I think that if we can look at it through certain lenses, we can gain some perspectives that we might not have had before.
I agree. And, our curriculum that we launched over the last couple of years, we've really tied in this aspect of it, right? And it's also a conversation that you still working with clients similar to how I do down here is part of the conversation that we want them really to understand. And the reason for that is so that it's one more way that they can influence ultimately their experience they're having, right?
Yeah, there's so much truth in what you're saying, and it just makes me think of, if we become dependent upon somebody, whether we're experiencing chronic pain or whether it's socioeconomic, whatever the context may be, if we are dependent upon someone or something, and then all of a sudden that's no longer at our immediate service, then that could be a huge upregulation or a huge increase in the stresses that are already there. So I think an important question becomes, what can we do while we're in this, scenario of isolation, whether it's in the States or in Canada or wherever it is? What do we have an influence on to make sure that, we take a look at the mental health side of things, and as it relates to chronic pain, what can we do in addition to the exercises that we might have been given and what we might be doing?
Right. And one of the things that I always highlight that I think is so important is exercise, especially a strategic home exercise program, is a piece of control that a person has, right? And that has a psychological overflow to it as well, right? And the beliefs behind it. But what do you think some of the people, with these kind of stressors, what are a couple nuggets that they can grab hold on to give them a sense of a little bit more of that control and even self-intervention, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a tough question. I'm going to stay away from all the cliches. Yeah. I'm not so sure that they're helpful in these scenarios. I think, what I know about, if people are experiencing chronic pain, or they're bumping up against anxieties, or whatever the stressors are, I think at times we internalize them and we start carrying them around. And there's a whole bunch of research on internalizing and as it relates to shame. So if we can get to the point where we start to recognize, if I'm experiencing chronic pain, or I'm going through anxiety, or I'm bumping up against, some depression, I am not the problem. The problem is the problem. And I think that is an enormous distinction to make. And it's rooted in studies of anthropology, right? Going into cultures and seeing, what are their mini subsystems in terms of beliefs, values, and how do they go about communicating these things. But there's a huge difference between someone who's carrying around the internal thought or belief that I'm experiencing pain, therefore I must be the problem, versus I'm someone who is experiencing pain, and that's just one small aspect of how I might define myself.
Perfect. Yeah. And who I am, right?
No question about it. And when challenges come up, whatever they are, they have a way of just gaining our attention, and a metaphor that I'll often use with clients is, when it's a cloudy day, we often forget that the sun is always shining. If we're on an airplane and we reach, when we're ascending, we get above the clouds, the sun is always there. But when we're experiencing troubles, and pain is one of them, we just see the clouds, and they seem to linger, and they really highlight, some of the deficits that we might be going through. But experiencing chronic pain is just one aspect of what it is to be a human being. So one of the things that I might ask anybody, anybody that I'm working with, or the folks that are watching, which is, if you could, to me or to Anthony, let's say someone's experiencing a heightened state of anxiety as it relates to their chronic pain, let's say, if you could introduce me, let's say I'm talking to you, Anthony, if you could introduce me to you when chronic pain doesn't have an invitation to have this conversation, how might you introduce yourself to me? So what that does is it allows them to say, or at least consider, hold on a second, he's asking me about myself away from this thing that I'm experiencing.
Right.
So it does a tremendous job to separate an individual and how they view themselves, also known as their identity, how they view themselves outside of a particular problem and the influence that problem might have.
I think that's excellent, because we see, and I often use the analogy of love and pain and how we define it and how the experience is all different. And you'll often find people who define themselves by the relationship they're in with their significant other, right?
Yeah.
And if that something happens with that relationship and that person doesn't love them or is not with them anymore, it takes away from their self-worth when it really it shouldn't. The relationship and that person is completely separate from them. And these are sort of analogies that might be of value to people when they think about that. So the individual who's currently out of work and is or the business is shut down, like ours for the most part, could be feeling anxiety because, hey, I'm the breadwinner, or I'm financially responsible for these people, and now that's away. That changes my physiological response as a whole, and now I'm experiencing pain, or an increase in pain, or physical limitations for that, and I haven't made that association. And if I do make that association, this gives me an opportunity to do some of what you're describing, along with my exercises that are a sense of empowerment and control, and disassociate the event of the economic hardship to the physical experience that I'm having at the same time.
Absolutely, no question about it. We have a way in which, our brains, and Daniel Kahneman, and I promise I won't get too nerdy or sciencey with the folks that are watching, but there's a really cool individual, Daniel Kahneman, who is a psychologist and an economist, and he won a Nobel Prize for his work that related around associative coherence. And what that meant was we have automatic mechanisms in our mind that start to piece together elements and create a story. So if I bend over, like I've got a pencil or a pen in my hand here, let's say, I'm standing upright and I bend down to pick it up. And all of a sudden, I feel some pain in my back. Well, my brain is looking at what was the causal relationship in the moment. So it says, okay, what's going on here? Well, there's a pen, I bent over, and then I experienced pain. So the brain jumps to a conclusion of that's the reason behind my pain.
Yeah.
And when we look at that, we go, okay, well, I wonder if there's another possibility here. I wonder if it's not so all or nothing, right? And the associative coherence research that he did led to a follow-up discovery of what you see is all there is, right? So in that scenario, in the moment, it was standing, bending over, picking up a pen.
Yep.
Right. So what that individual saw in the moment was all that there was. Therefore, there was a conclusion or a story that's built around it. And then we just start carrying it around as here's why I'm in pain. And this is my pain. Or maybe it's even my fault. I should have known better, use my hips, knees, and ankles and not my back. I know better. And we start carrying around these things and we internalize it as being objective truth, when it's highly subjective in terms of how it was created, the story.
Right. And I just had a similar conversation with a client of mine in Indiana. And one of the things we talked about is he had a really bad day of back pain, right? And he'd been doing pretty well, and we hadn't seen each other for a while, but he associated with sitting down for too long at the computer. But he'd been doing that anyway since he's been on this in this home office scenario, right?
Right.
So prior to that, he was telling me about the situation. He was up till 4 a.m. I suggested, lack of sleep, lack of hydration, change in diet, because he had these deadlines to hit, right? So his gut health, his hydration, his sleep, the enormous stress that was going on, and he associated with strictly as his back, because as you're saying, and I've had this conversation with clients many times, we seek to make relationships, and then we're able to validate that relationship with the proof that, hey, I was sitting too long. What else could it be?
Yes.
Right? And if we open that up to other possibilities, as you're describing, it offers other possibilities for resolving that problem or avoiding it in the future, right? Because if there's only one thing, then we think, well, as long as I'm always this age or this posture or have this job responsibility, then I'm screwed, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what a wonderful environment that we can provide with individuals like the individual from Indiana, where we can start to question, like, hey, I wonder what else was going on, and not to discredit, your experience and kind of what you've just shared with me, but have you considered some of these other things? And, what can we do during all of these times of uncertainty to not take something and put a stamp of this is true, this is objective, and it just crosses all contexts and all relations. What do we have at our disposal? And I think circling back, you've given me an opportunity to circle back to the answer that I gave a little while ago, which is, if we can, and I'm speaking to not just you, Anthony, but the people who are watching as well, if we can recognize that I am not the problem, whether it's chronic pain or anxiety or whatever it is, I'm trying to list some common ones that many people might be going through. I am not the problem. The problem is the problem. And to be able to externalize that and separate who I am and how I see myself away from that problem and its influences and its tactics and its strategies and how it wants to communicate to us. If we can do that, then we can start to say, oh, okay, there's multiplicity here. It's not just an all or nothing black and white scenario.
It's not a binary. What's the word?
Binary?
Binary.
Yeah.
It's not a binary choice, right? And I love that. We're going to say that again. The problem is the problem, right? I'm not the problem. The problem is the problem. And that allows us to focus outside of ourselves. Yeah. Even if we are part of the solution, we're not the problem, right? And we can have a tremendous amount of influence over the solution and the aspects that we can control, but we're not the problem.
Exactly. And I'll never forget the first time that I came across this concept. And it was from a social worker. He's no longer with us here. He passed away. His name was Michael White. And he had years and years and years of social work experience and research and practical experience. And I was watching him on a recording, and he goes, I'd like to just mention that this might not sound like a huge revelation to many of you, but I need you to know that this took me the better part of, I can't remember how many years, let's just say a decade, to be able to understand and articulate it this clearly, which is whatever someone's going through, whatever it is, they are not the problem. And we can remove that word. We can say trouble. We're not our troubles, whatever, but we'll just use problem for now. We are not the problem. The problem is the problem. And then, Anthony, what that allows me to do and you to do and anybody else that wants to get curious about the problem is say, okay, well, if there's multiplicity here and there's it's not just black and white, there's all kinds of colors in between. If I was talking to you, Anthony, I say, hey, Anthony, I wonder, would you share with me, would you be able to share with me how you notice anxiety showing up in your life? And what that would do after we kind of make that distinction of the problem's the problem, what that would do is it would provide you an opportunity to provide context. Problems are contextual, right? A person that goes, hey, I'm experiencing pain 24 hours a day. They might be experiencing pain a great deal throughout the day, but it's likely that there are moments where it's at least not a 10 out of 10. Maybe it's a 7 out of 10 or a 2 out of 10. There are exceptions to that omni-contextual I'm always in pain statement. So the more that we can understand the problem and then how it shows up for us, and that's what makes my job as a counselor incredibly challenging, because anybody that comes in, if I saw people, if I saw 5 people in a row that were experiencing anxiety is showing up for all 5 of those people very differently. And this, it's very similar to working with people in chronic pain. Chronic pain influences people very differently.
Yes. Yeah. And if we're able to, and I don't know if this is a great metaphor, but if we're able to poke holes in their story, which is the narrative that they've maintained for long periods of time, which has given them some sense of control over whatever's going on, because they can describe it in a way they need to describe it. And if we can kind of knock the legs out of it, poke the holes out of it, poke holes in it, whatever you want to do, and they start to question their own narrative, that's a positive, right? Because now they can see things through a different lens, and then they can also see, well, if it's possibly this and not what I've always thought, then there's a chance that I have these other positive interventions that can help me where I want to be with that. And when somebody's been challenged, especially with chronic pain for prolonged periods of time, it becomes part of their lifestyle, part of their identity. And more than likely, by the time they've gotten to us, they've been there and done that with countless other providers. And if we're able to combine the exercises that really make sense, or strategic or not generic, and help them with some of this understanding that has evolved with us over the years through the Function First program, as the science has become clearer and clearer how relevant this is, I think we can really do a great service for people that way. And that's also why some people will have pain and they'll get better no matter what, and other people take much longer to get through the process and many years of it. And it's complex, right? It's not just cut and dry. We know that. And I think it would be nice for people to understand sort of your journey with Function First, and how it gotten to the point where you're like my go-to guy now as my director of education, way before you had even probably considered that academic track a couple years ago, right?
Well, that's exactly what happened. We met almost 10 years ago, and for those, in fact, some of you watching might even recognize me, because what I would do, I'm a little bit thinner, a little bit grayer, but what I used to do is I would fly out to San Diego. Anthony would allow me to come down and kind of, observe him with his clients in pain. I was 3, 4, 5 times a year flying down, almost like an intern, to learn more about this approach. And as I was, just experiencing that part of my own journey, I recognized how often Anthony was approaching situations outside of just a biomechanical perspective. And I won't use any names, but I remember vividly a particular individual who got incredibly emotional. The individual, there was an emotional flood where there was clear, tears running down their face. And it had very little to do with any biomechanical intervention or exercise. And it was at that moment where I said to myself, wow, okay, there is so much more to the chronic pain experience and moving beyond chronic pain than just the biomechanics or the movements that are involved. And that was, that started, my journey with you down, the biopsychosocial model and looking at pain from a multidimensional perspective. But then I started to consider the fact, how important a consultation is with each individual.
Right.
I personally, in my own code of ethics, cannot walk out onto an assessment floor of any kind and start doing movement or musculoskeletal assessments without at least sitting down with an individual first. We're missing out on so much of their story and where they are in their experience in pain. So once I had these distinctions, I got really intrigued with the idea of the psychological and social side of the equation. And, together with you and some other colleagues, we dove deep into some of that literature in the pain science. And I got so enthralled by it that I started to consider the idea of going to grad school and getting, a master's in counseling psychology, so I could better influence this aspect of working with people in pain.
Fantastic. And as a result, you've been able to add additional value to just kind of how the function first approach is modeled in terms of how we're working with clients. And needless to say that you're in the trenches too. You're seeing clients as well. You're not just seeing counseling clients. You still work with clients from an exercise perspective and what that does, and you're able to bring that additional skill set along with it, right? Which is tremendous value to the end user.
Tremendous value. They're a little bit different hats, obviously, but there's so many similarities. And I split my week up 2 and 2. Right, 2 days I put on my counseling hat, and 2 days I work with people in chronic pain. But what I'd like to maybe highlight are, even though they're different, right? People seeking mental health services for their challenges and people seeking chronic pain services for their pain. There are so many similarities in terms of the way in which individuals relate to their experience. Internalizing it, we've already talked about as an example. Carrying this idea around that I am the problem versus the problem's the problem. And here's a thing also, AC, that I know about problems is in either side of those spectrums, problems thrive in isolation. If a problem could, whatever the problem is, if a problem could have its way, it would say, Anthony, please don't go see someone like Kevin. Don't talk to him about it. I need you to, adhere to, men are strong and they don't talk about their feelings, and whatever, cultural values that person might be carrying around. Problems thrive in isolation. And when we can bring them out with someone who has some acumen or expertise in this realm, now the problem is starting to go, uh-oh. This
interesting, because that made me think also just in terms of maybe some of the other experiences people are having from an isolation standpoint. It may not be what we would typically, so you're talking about isolate the problem within myself.
Yes.
But even, spouses having the opportunity or being amongst family and that sort of thing. And then there's people right now that are currently in isolation on their own. But even the people that are with family members may have a sense of isolation as well, because their social outlets through work or through camaraderie with friends or bonds that they have elsewhere. There still could be a sense of isolation that relates to, again, the experience that they're having, as much as they might even love their family. If they're not getting the opportunity to express themselves, or their interactions that they're used to in other ways could lead to another kind of sense of isolation that ultimately may further feed the I don't want to burden my family, or I don't want to burden people via video with what's going on, and again prolong that process before they might ever even get a chance to go speak with somebody professionally about it.
No question about it.
An interesting scenario we're in right now. So I want to be respectful of your time, and also hopefully make this digestible for most people. Any final thoughts, little nuggets you want to leave people with in terms of, considering the uniqueness of the situation and how they can look at the problem as an external thing and further move themselves forward?
Yeah, and I promised I wasn't going to use any cliches, and I hope that people watching don't see this as one. But what if we can get better at recognizing the problem and being able to separate it or externalize it, and then begin to recognize how it operates, the ways in which it may, kind of knock our sense of self-worth, or it may increase self-doubt, all kinds of things. If we can understand how it relates, right, and the context of it, then we can start to really believe the notion that problems are not permanent. And I think that's also something what happens when we internalize things. Using language, and you and I are huge advocates of the language that we use. And, during times of stress, which is right now, oftentimes we use top shelf descriptors to describe our pain or our problems. So many people I've worked with is, my anxiety or my depression. I wonder if there's an opportunity to just be mindful of how we're describing something that we're experiencing to ourselves, and to see if we can catch ourselves like, oh, hold on a minute. That's actually not my anxiety. It's actually just anxiety. Anxiety is showing up, and it's having me feel worried or anxious, but that's not a complete description of who I am. So if we can start to do these things, I think we'll find that there is an end, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and until we get there, we do have some strategies that we can tap into to help us cope during just this immediate short term that we're in right now.
Awesome. I think that's gonna go a long way for those that were able to hear that from this. And so again, I want to be respectful of your time and keep this as something that people will not get bogged down with watching. But I appreciate you. I appreciate your insight into the differences of knowledge that you've brought to Function First, and how appreciative I am that, because you've helped expand what we do in that context. And I wanted also people to have the opportunity to see you and hear you a little bit more, because in relationship to the contribution that you've made, your exposure within the company may not be what it needs to be. But we've got people, 33 states and 17 countries these days that we've got come in, and they need to know that there's a lot of minds contributing to our desire to help more people and contribute to the overall well-being of those who give us the opportunity to serve them. So, my friend, thank you.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I want to extend to any viewers watching. If there's any questions or follow-ups, you could let Anthony know, and then you could direct them to me, or I can answer some questions via you. Or if people are feeling isolated and they have questions about some of the things that I talked about, I'd be more than happy to provide additional clarity. So anybody that works with Anthony, I lend myself to that regard as well.
Thank you, my friend. I'm sure there will be people that want to take you up on that. So thank you, everybody, for watching, and keep in touch with us. And if there's anything we can do, continue to help during this time, please do let us know. Thank you.